Shall we? Do you think
Yeah, we will start now. Yeah, I would just, say a few words before you start. So I'm really happy and grateful and honored to welcome Teresa Ting for the second time at the weekly discussions on plurilingualism. And this is today a kind of continuation of her first talk, in which she focused on some insights, on the language of learning and education as seen through neuroscience. And today we are going to see some insights from CLIL, and I expect that you will also show the materials that we may use in CLIL classes and how content and language can be actually integrated. Just a few words to those, or for those who haven't been listening to Teresa Ting yet. So Teresa lives in Italy, right? Kind of very south down. And but her education goes to the USA. So she studied in the USA, and she is also not just a linguist, but she's also a scientist, as she did her Bachelor of Science in Psychology and then minor in Sociology, and then in Biology and Chemistry. And her PhD is in Biology with specialization in neurobiology. And then at the end, there is Master of Arts in Professional Development for ELT practitioners. So this is, really an expert who has integrated content and language herself. And I believe that you can also speak from your own experiences, how this looks like. So very happy to have you here, and the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. And thank you for this opportunity. It's great. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and let's see. Okay, so now this is, as Carmen says, part 2. This is the languages matter. Seminar 1, as Carmen said, was the language of learning and education as seen through neuroscience, and we're going to touch on review some of those things at the end. And we're going to look at designing instructional materials. Okay. And today, last time we looked at primary school and preschool. Today we're going to look at university materials. Okay, content. So now after last time, I was thinking that in Slovenia and Italy, we are two little small countries where we are the only people that speak our language. And here we are in front of Spanish that has a wide distribution, and Chinese that has many, many people. Okay, and then there's this globish English that's hegemony of languages. Okay, so we have to be careful. And so why we are preserving our national language? It's a language that only we speak. However, at the same time, we have to enable our students to master a language that everybody else speaks. So this is a kind of an equilibrium that we have to balance. And this is interesting. And what's interesting is you have dubbing and we don't. So these are very interesting comparisons between our two contexts. So that's challenge number 1. And I'm going to offer the solution, and so the solution is translanguaging. Okay, the potential solution. I'll show you tasks on this. Challenge number 2 is the ability to use language well to speak and write about content understandings appropriately, accurately, and precisely. CALP, Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, which is what we touched on last time. Okay? Age-appropriate and content-relevant disciplinary discourse. So, for example, after teaching English for 12 years to our students in Italy, like I said last time, it's not enough to say, my favorite sport is soccer. Okay? They have to have age-appropriate and content-relevant abilities to communicate professionally. Yes?
Sorry, we still see the first slide.
Oh my goodness. Oh, and here I am looking here. Well, in that case, I'm going to have to share my whole screen. Okay? I'm going to stop sharing then. Last time it worked, right? When I shared my whole screen. Okay, let me try sharing. Okay. Thank you for letting me know. Let me try this then. Not as nice. Okay, is that okay? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, give me 5 more minutes then. Okay, so here we are, the first and second, we've already talked about that. Okay, and we're going to look at some materials now from tertiary. And I was saying that our two countries are very comparable. Okay, we have to be careful of the dominant languages. They're dominant for Globish and then Spanish and then Chinese because of so many people. This is how many people speak Chinese and then everything else, okay? Preservation of our national language, at the same time enabling our students to master a language that everybody speaks. Yeah, okay? So this is a kind of a challenge for us in our little countries with our languages. And the potential solution, like I said, would be translanguaging. Okay, challenge number 2. Let's do this again because this is important. The ability to use language well, to speak and write about content understandings appropriately, accurately, and precisely. Okay, this is CALP, Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, which we talked about, which is age appropriate and content relevant. And that's what students need in both L1 and the foreign language. Giusto, okay? Sorry, giusto. Okay, so that's what we should be aiming for. And what is disciplinary discourse? Let's define it. Okay, here is some work by Jeff Zweig, excellent book, and I'll put it in the post-seminar references. He refers that the analogy is the School of Athens, okay, by Raphael. Now here is a beautiful masterpiece, and this is disciplinary discourse. Look how beautiful and harmonious this masterpiece is. If you take one philosopher, this is just a sentence. This is a sentence in a discourse, just a single philosopher. If you take just one word in this masterpiece, what you have is just a disembodied arm, an arm that belongs to nobody, okay? Now, so this is a masterpiece, but this is not, okay? This arm is not a masterpiece. The philosopher is okay, but it's nothing like the masterpiece. So discourse is not terminology and technical words. It's not these arms and legs and feet, okay? Because if we teach only arms, legs, and feet, at the end, we get terminology salads that make no sense. For those of us who have any experience teaching any kind of content, the students mix up the concepts, the terminology, and it becomes a terminology salad, and it is not a masterpiece. So what we want is this masterpiece, disciplinary discourse, which is a beautiful masterpiece. And the potential solution is translanguaging. Okay, this is the potential solution today. So we're talking disciplinary discourse production in both L1 and the foreign language, the global foreign language. And remember Janusz, okay? He needs this kind of language. He also needs CALP to sell his design to IKEA. Remember, he's our carpentry student who wants to sell his furniture design to IKEA. So he has to have the right language to present his material, his product. Okay, so even Janusz needs this. And indeed, after 12 years of schooling, students should be able to produce well-written reports in L1. No? Okay, at least. Okay? And likewise, all those years of foreign language instruction, they must be able to manage foreign language in academic ways. Giusto. Okay? Because otherwise, why are we teaching them foreign languages for so long? And however, this is not a given. Because we at the university complain, content teachers complain that students cannot write their theses in proper L1, okay? And this is not because they have not read enough properly written textbooks. They have. It is not because they have not listened to properly speaking professors. They have. But why are they not producing properly written texts or speaking in proper ways? Okay, so that is our challenge. So that's challenge number 2. Okay, challenge number 2. Now, this takes me, we're only going to deal with 2 challenges today. This takes me to the language dilemma of content instruction. Okay, the language dilemma of content instruction. Let's walk through this together. This is what it looks like. The language dilemma of content instruction. We start with the fact, point 1. And I'm going to give you a paper with this in it. Okay, so just relax and listen. Okay, so disciplinary concepts are complex and abstract. Okay, of course. So, since they're complex and abstract, point number 2, they are embedded in language that is complex and abstract. And this is called disciplinary discourse. Yeah? Point number 3. Disciplinary discourse is the condoned way that disciplinary experts language about shared disciplinary knowledge. So the community of practice, they have decided that this is how we speak about tables for IKEA. This is how physicists speak about motion. This is how surgeons have to speak about cardiology, etc. Okay? This is discipline condoned ways. Okay. Now, point number 4. But, even in L1, disciplinary discourse is like a foreign language for students who are still learning about new disciplinary concepts. Research has shown this, okay? It is like a foreign language, even in L1. So point number 5. Oops, I skipped a number. Okay, point number 5. To facilitate content learning, content teachers might avoid disciplinary discourse. They simplify the language they use to explain the complex content. So, teachers are aware, content experts are aware that disciplinary discourse is like a foreign language. So what do? They help the students understand the content by simplifying the language. Correctly so. They use analogies and metaphors, and they try to deconstruct the complexity of the concepts by simplifying the language. Okay? That's what good teachers do, and they should do. Next point. This deconstructing into simplified language might contribute to students' understanding of content, but does not help students master the proper discourse. Therefore, the next point. But, at the end of the day, content teachers expect their students to use disciplinary discourse to speak and write about where we started, disciplinary concepts. So, teachers they simplify the language to help understand the content. Students understand the content, but then we expect them to use the proper discourse to speak about the concepts. But we have not modeled it for them. Or if we have modeled it for them, somehow it doesn't get to them. And that's why the writing doesn't look fabulous. Okay, and that's why university professors complain that theses, which are at the end of a student's career, so they should be very, very good students, are not well written. Okay? Any questions or thoughts about this right now before I continue? No? Okay. Now this is coming out in ELTJ very soon, so I'll send you this image anyways, okay? So this is the language dilemma of content instruction. Now, if you look at this language dilemma, what this dilemma is basically a balance of concepts and the language of those concepts. Okay, disciplinary discourse. So disciplinary concepts and disciplinary discourse. Now, here is the dilemma also. There are two dilemmas. How can I teach language if I am a content expert? This is what a content teacher says. I'm a physics professor. Why should I teach language? If the students cannot write properly in Slovenian about physics, it's a language problem. But it's not a language problem, because if you, the physicist, do not teach students how to write like a physicist, who's going to do it? Okay, so that is one person's dilemma. Point number two, how can I teach language if, two, I am not a content expert? To make this point, let's look at this. Complex content requires complex language. Whole discourse, the School of Athens, the whole discourse, okay, the School of Athens. For example, if you're not a chemistry teacher and I ask you, how can we know if English genitive S is correct for an electron's proton or proton's neutron? Which one is correct, English teacher, for genitive S? Now, if you're a chemistry teacher, none of this is correct, because it's like saying, which one's correct, a heart's lung or a kidney's ear? No, the genitive S is not the problem here, okay? It's the content which is the problem. It's not the language is not the big problem in this kind of interpretation. So, if you're not a content expert, how can you deal with the discourse? If you're a content expert, how can you deal with the discourse? This is the big language dilemma of content instruction for everybody. Okay, now that's challenge number two, and the potential solution is going to be translanguaging. Okay, so now let's break this content and language balance down into two continuums. The purple is the language, the green will be the content. Okay, we're going to do the two continuums. Okay, these are monodimensional. Okay, here we are. If we look at the language dimension, we can have Jim Cummins. Jim Cummins, we already know his BICS, social language, easy. CALP, academic language, complex. Okay, on this single axis continuum. That's L, language. Let's look at C, content. Vygotsky, that Carmen mentioned last time. Vygotsky was very interested in schooling because schooling helped us move knowledge into abstract spheres. Without schooling, we can plow the fields, continue manual, hands-on knowledge, but we will never be pushed to think abstractly and about intangible concepts. So for Vygotsky, schooling was important because it moved spontaneous knowledge into what he called scientific knowledge, abstract, okay, as opposed to tangible. So when children come to school, they have a baggage of spontaneous knowledge about tangible things, okay? But school pushes us to think about abstract concepts, which he calls scientific knowledge. That's Vygotsky. So here are the two axes. So, for example, when we talk to children about nutrition, when they're children, young children, we show fruits and vegetables. When we're in high school, our university talking about nutrition, we're talking about molecules and molecules, okay? Intangible. Now, so this is these two monodimensional continua. Let's relate C to L on the same plane. Let's cross these two and make these two-dimensional. Let's create a two-dimensional map of this in L1. So what we have is CALP, academic L1, BICS, social L1. What we have is knowledge which is spontaneous, tangible, or knowledge which is, according to Vygotsky's definition, scientific or abstract. In L1, we're dealing in L1 now. Okay, so now let's change this slightly. Let's make this language unfamiliar language familiar, and content familiar, content unfamiliar. Okay? Now, in L1. And let's add to this our little balance, okay? Our C and L balance. And notice that this circle here, okay? This, we're going to be talking about, this little red circle. It's a very delicate hinge in this very delicate balance, okay? Now, if you think of this, this is a two-dimensional content and language grid. Okay, we're a two-dimensional grid now. If we were to think about it in three-dimensional space, we only have two dimensions right now, okay? And soon I'm going to ask you to put in a third dimension. But right now we have a two-dimensional grid, which is made from two monodimensional continua. Okay. Now, a little bit of interaction here. I want you to use the words upper and lower and right and left. Okay, think on your own. I'm not going to try and do the chat because it's too much. Okay, I want you to think. In which quadrant would content and language be more difficult for learners to understand? So write on your piece of paper, question number 1, upper right or upper left or lower right or lower left in these quadrants. Is 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, upper, lower, left, and right. Okay, question number 1. In which quadrant would content and language both be more difficult for learners to understand? Number 1. Okay. Then, question number 2. Which quadrant would best characterize the content and language of a medical school textbook? Question number 3. In which quadrant would both C and L be familiar? Both C and L be familiar. Okay. In which quadrant, number 4, in which quadrant will we place students' home language? For example, conversation between grandma and grandchildren. In which quadrant will we put children's home language? Number 5, finally, in which quadrant would we position a conversation between disciplinary experts who are familiar with both the content and also the language? In which quadrant would we place that? So, okay, conversation between disciplinary experts who are familiar with both content and language. With both content and language. Okay, so it's a trick question because there are only 2 quadrants here. I'm only talking about 2 quadrants here. Okay? Basically, when we have, let's look at question number 1. Both be difficult, here. Medical school textbook, here. In which quadrant would both content and familiar be familiar? Both content and language be familiar? Here. In which one would be home language? Conversation between grandma and grandchildren? Probably here. And where would experts talking to each other be? Also here. They're experts. For them, content and language are both familiar. So even 2 medical doctors, medical students would be here. Medical textbook would be here though. Okay? So, okay, I just want you to concentrate on these extremes. Okay, so here, however, when you are learning, when language is unfamiliar and content is unfamiliar, the risk is that you break this delicate little red hinge on this balance. So, content is too heavy and language is too heavy. So this is called working memory overload. Working memory overload. Let's see what it looks like in Slovenian. I use Google Translate. I don't know if it's correct. Forgive me if it is not correct. But, okay. So, the heart has 4 chambers. Okay, so here, look at all these concepts. There are 6 concepts about the heart. Concept number 1. Concept number 2, it shows left-right symmetry, blah, 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 blah. The upper one's called atrium, the lower one called ventricle. That's the third concept in what the professor is talking about. So here's a professor lecturing about the heart with 6 concepts, and he's blah, 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 okay? And Charlie speaks Slovenian. He's Slovenian, okay? So he's listening to this in L1. But Charlie thinks, chamber? What chamber? Chamber music? Torture chamber? I hope this is the correct word, okay? Which chamber? So he doesn't understand which chamber. Then he realized, chamber means area in the heart, okay? And the heart has 4 of these chambers. So he's understood the new language, and he's understood the new content. So Charlie has figured it out, okay? And that's great. And we know from last seminar that Charlie's brain works very quickly, okay? Remember the Cambridge text, which is all jumbled up, and we were able to understand. So Charlie's brain is the same. It works quickly and understands what this input means. Unfortunately, by the time Charlie has understood, his professor is speaking about this. So Charlie has not heard anything about concept 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. Are we surprised that Charlie does not learn everything we mentioned? No, not at all. If you know that the brain processes information quickly to make sense of everything, this is not surprising. This is obvious. Okay? Now, this is working memory overload. Too much content, too much language, ultra heavy. Okay. Now, that is quadrant D here. Calb is unfamiliar, language is unfamiliar, and concepts are unfamiliar. That's quadrant D, even in our L1. Working memory overload. That is what could happen in quadrant D. Okay, if we are not careful with how we provide instruction. Let's look at quadrant A. I want to give you 30 seconds thinking about what could be happening. Who is speaking in quadrant A? I already gave you some hints earlier. Okay. Okay, so let's continue. Home language or home topics, or expert-to-expert conversation. It's already familiar knowledge and familiar language between experts. Okay? Now, let's look at quadrant. Okay? So, that's quadrant. Whoops, sorry, I'm going backward. So, how about quadrant C and D, and C and B? Could you think to yourself, at least define it in terms of content is blah and language is blah. At least define that. And then, step number 1, just define that to yourself. Okay? So in quadrant C, content is familiar. Language is unfamiliar. So see, content is small and language is big, cognitively heavy, demanding. Concepts are known, not demanding. Okay? Here, quadrant B, concepts are very new, unfamiliar, so cognitively demanding, but language is familiar, so cognitively not demanding. So look how it counterbalances. Okay, so it doesn't stress this very weak joint. Okay? Now, what could be a context for this? What could be a teaching context or a discipline context for this? And what could be a discipline context for this? Okay? I'm going to ask you to think about where would you position the teaching of social sciences, and where would you position the teaching of chemistry? Would chemistry education be more like this or more like this? And would social science instruction be more like this or more like this? Okay, so let's go on. So here, familiar concepts can be paraphrased through complex language. So familiar concepts like unemployment, people without jobs. People without jobs is an easy concept to understand, and we paraphrase it through complex language. Okay? And, well, that would be more like C. While here we have familiar language for paraphrasing complex concepts. So, for example, chemistry concepts. And we talk about it in lighter language, okay, which is what we said good teachers do. Now, here, social sciences and some moments in STEM instruction. Okay? Here, on the other hand, we have STEM disciplines and moments in social science instruction. Okay? So, this is, okay, where we are counterbalancing. But these are typical of what we do. The problem is this, that no matter what you're teaching, you have to get here to quadrant D without breaking the balance. I repeat, what you need is to get here without breaking the balance, no matter if you're social science or non-social science, etc. Okay? Because Janos needs it. Okay? Now, this is a challenge in L1 instruction, L1 content instruction. Already, this is the challenge. And this is the language dilemma of content instruction. How do we get here without breaking the balance? Okay? So, this is very complicated. So, let us add a foreign language. Okay? To make life just that much more interesting. Now, let's see. The potential solution is translanguaging. Let's see what happens. Let's see how to do this. Remember L1, familiar. Unfamiliar. L1 is familiar. Content is abstract and unfamiliar. Content is familiar and tangible. This is a two-dimensional grid, okay? In a three-dimensional space. What we need to do now is, of course, put in the third dimension of a foreign language. Here we have familiar English from general English courses and unfamiliar academic English from English textbooks, which is the English that students need when they go to the workforce. Okay? This is the Slovenian students need when they go into the workforce, and this is the kind of English they need to go into the workforce. Okay? Now, here we have, therefore, a three-dimensional translanguaging grid. Let's see how this works. How might it work? Okay, let's look at translanguaging task number 1. I took this from my son's medical school textbook on immunology. Okay, L1 textbook. Where are we? Heavy content and heavy language, potentially breaking the balance. Okay, so heavy concepts and L1 calc, potentially breaking the balance. And I'm going to show you two tasks that refer to 2 paragraphs, which were in Italian. These are in Italian, so typical university textbooks, very heavy. Okay, paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. Okay, now this will be coming out in the ELTJ article, so I will share it with you as soon as it comes out. Okay, now we're going to look at how we tackle this L1 textbook, because our problem in Slovenia and in Italy is that students must learn Slovenian and must learn Italian. Okay, we have to preserve our languages. So how are we going to do this? We're going to use English. The task is, notice the bold heading in paragraph 1 of your Italian textbook. Work together to decide which of the 3 English paragraphs below best summarize the information contained in this heading. We're talking about this heading here. Okay? This bold heading. Just one bold sentence. This one. That's all the task focuses on. Be careful here. Okay? And look at this. So this is the heading in Italian in the textbook, and this is the instruction. And here are the 3 paragraphs. I'm going to walk you through this because, again, it's explained very well. Okay? Oh, look at this. Now, A, B, and C. Okay. It's about microorganisms and immunity and an innate immune system. Innate immune system, innate immune system. I'm going to show you something. I'm going to show you the strategy. Okay? So here is something about this. Only one sentence in Italian, and this is a lot of stuff in English. Option A, option B, option C. Is that clear how the task is, everybody? Is that clear for everybody? Okay, so the students have to just look at this Italian heading, and they have to decide which one of these 3 English paragraphs best summarizes this information. Okay, that's how dense this Italian information is. It's so dense that in English you have to unpack it into many sentences. Okay, now let me show you the strategy here. The first part, look at the orange in A, B, and C. The orange part of these 3 paragraphs in English, all 3 provide the same information, but are paraphrased differently. This information expands on the L1 heading and reminds us of prior knowledge. So let me say that again. There are 3 paragraphs in English. The task is which one summarizes the Italian heading, but all 3 in English start with the same information, but paraphrased in a different way. Okay? The last sentence B of B in blue provides the best summary of information contained in the heading. So B is the correct answer. B is the correct answer. But the last sentences of A and C, the green, also provide correct information, but it is not information in the heading. Okay? It is not information in the heading. It's just information in the paragraph. It is not information in the heading. Is that clear? Okay. Now, what is happening here? Can you identify one instructional strategy when I do this? When I design a task like this, what is the instructional strategy that we're using here? I want you to think of one instructional strategy. And can you think of one brain-aware strategy from last lesson that we used to design this task? Okay. Just think for 30 seconds. If you want, you can write in the chat. Oh, somebody wrote. Okay. If you want, you can write in the chat. So we can think of Alma. You can write now. Please write. Okay, write in the chat. What would be one instructional strategy, or what was one brain-aware strategy that we dealt with last time, that we mentioned last time? Okay, send it along, please. Okay, or write in your notes. Okay. Okay. So, does anybody want to turn on the microphone and venture remember something? Okay, well, I'm not asking for earth-shattering things. Okay, here. Let's look at one instructional strategy. Content. We're increasing time on task. Students revisit prior content and learn new content. Basically, by the time you finish this stupid task, you will have read A and B and C at least 2 times, plus the heading in Italian at least 3 times. You cannot not learn the content. Okay? It's just a stupid task. But it is having you go through this English many times to look at the Italian. In language, point number 2 here, language. When we're paraphrasing, it amplifies lexical range and communication potential. We're teaching students different ways in the orange of saying the same thing. Okay? So we're showing them language at its best. Then there's implicit learning, bullet point number 3. Implicit learning of information within paragraph 1. As I told you, the green is not in the heading. It is in the paragraph. Okay? Sorry. So, implicit learning of information within paragraph 1, that is not explicit to the task. The task is asking you for the heading, not for the information in the paragraph. Okay? So, this is all that says in the heading, but this is in the paragraph. But when students encounter this information, the green information, during self-study, it is already more familiar because they've read it through these stupid tasks. So in the classroom, the teacher is guiding the students through these stupid tasks, and B is the correct answer for the task. But since students had to read A and C to understand that these are not the right answer for the task, they have learned something about the content. And when they study, of course they have to study, when they study at home, the L1 content will already be familiar, thanks to the English tasks. Okay? What is a brain-aware strategy used to design this task? Solving solvable problems and working socially. That is all. Okay? Remember last time? Solving solvable problems, pupillary dilation, maximum attention, you enter flow. Norepinephrine in the reticular system, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And flow increases attention, right here, which is the optimal state for learning. Then, brain, the other point we did last time was the brain processes information quickly. So having it, so we don't know what the students think when we're lecturing at them. But when they're doing these tasks direct their attention to the exact information we want them to pay attention to. Okay? Otherwise, we don't know what they're paying attention to. Okay? So we're directing their attention. Now, any questions about this task? We'll tackle some more. We'll look at one more task and then we'll look at some questions. So here we are, back to our 2-dimensional grids. Okay? This potentially could break the balance, just going to a textbook. But this is what we need to get to. We need to have them produce language. Okay? Now, the previous task, task 1, did not help them produce any language yet. Okay? But we're letting them understand content. Now, let's remember, now we're putting in, what we had done in task 1 was insert the 3rd dimension, the foreign language BICS. Remember, this is the 3rd dimensional axis. Okay, so this is L1 BICS. This is 2-dimensional. We're making it now 3-dimensional. And in this 3rd dimension, we have this English. So foreign language BICS is helping students reach L1 CALP. Familiar foreign language BICS serves as a scaffold into unfamiliar L1 CALP. So English, because they're English, because especially in Slovenia, your students' English, informal English, is so good. You can use that to help them understand their Slovenian textbooks. Okay? if you have Slovenian textbooks. You probably have them in English. But anyways, okay? Now, in this way, what we're doing is this. Complex concepts using simple language. But this simple language is actually a foreign language. Okay, now, let's look at translanguaging task number 2, and then I'll be done. Below are 2 texts referring to paragraph 2 of your L1 textbook. One text is from the notebook of a very studious first-year student on the left, and the other is from an English immunology textbook. Okay, so of course, here we're doing BICS, and here we're doing CALP in English. The 2 texts are not identical because the student's notes either 1 contains extra information she added to link this new information to that she had learned from previous lessons, or 2, she missed information from the English textbook. Okay, so this is a problem with this information. Work together, flow. Work together to highlight 1, extra information, and 2, missed information. And this refers to paragraph 2 of the L1 textbook. What are we doing again? We're having them read 10,000 times the same thing in different registers, and voila, they have to get the content. At the same time, so they're working to see which one's extra information here, which one's, what information did she miss, but this exemplifies foreign language CALP. And this is foreign language BICS. And basically they're working together to solve a stupid solvable problem. Okay. Now, which codes are being used here? L1 BICS, L1 CALP, foreign language BICS, or foreign language CALP? Okay, which codes are being used here? Well, foreign language CALP is here. So we're beginning to show them what foreign language CALP looks like. And they're referring to the L1 CALP because they're referring to the L1 textbook, right? Okay, and here is the foreign language BICS. So the only thing that's not being used here is L1 BICS in this task. And what is one instructional strategy being used? Increase time on task and thus content learning. Paraphrasing increases language exposure, amplifies lexical range. Familiarity with foreign language CALP versus foreign language BICS. So they're beginning to understand registers. These are students' notes. These are textbooks, textbook language. Cultivating register awareness. So here we're learning L1 CALP, but L1 CALP is supported through a foreign language BICS and foreign language CALP. But imagine trying to go straight to this foreign language CALP. That would be working memory overload. Okay? And this kind of stuff is useful for Janos, okay? Who has to learn both. So, here we are. The ability to use language well to speak and write about content understandings appropriately, accurately, and precisely. What have we done? We've used tasks, which are stupid problems, to solve together, which puts students into flow for the amount of time they can flow for. We don't need to have them flow for 3 days. We just need to have them flow for a little bit. When they finish the task, they can talk about anything they want. They're flowing because they're solving a solvable problem. The problem are set up like these, okay, for example. Now, let me show you results, okay? These are results from students from the Agricultural Institute. So they're the students who are very poor quality students academically, okay? Now, whoops, so Silvana is a chemistry teacher and Graziella is an English teacher. And this was published in this book, but it's in Italian, okay? Now, this is what they did. This is before they basically use these types of strategies to help their technical students in the technical high school learn about cheese manufacturing, okay? And before the test, before the EMI, English Medium Instruction, we just call it EMI, but they basically was just translanguaging, okay? Before these translanguaging tasks in STEM, they had students do, they analyzed how many words, total number of words that were written in a previous test. And we chose the 4 weakest students, okay, because it's not useful to look at good students. It's useful to look at weak students. So look at how weak the student is. They hardly wrote anything, okay, in a previous exam. Before, first it was about milk, now it's about cheese making, okay? At the intermediate level of the translanguaging tasks, these students already wrote more words. After these translanguaging tasks, they wrote even more words. And this is the final test in L1 in Italian. And look what they wrote. Of course, before it was in Italian. Okay? This is very interesting. What about the concepts? What percentage of concepts were the students able to mention in their wordy writing? Before the translanguaging tasks, they mentioned less than 10% of the concepts. Afterwards, this very weak student was able to mention 70% of the concepts that were taught through the translanguaging tasks. How about the number of content-specific terms used? Again, great improvement. Of course, we know, as teachers we know, it's not because students are stupid. It's because they don't have the right input, okay? And once we have the right input, look at what they can do, okay? And this is because they're solving solvable problems, they are paying attention to the correct information, and the tasks take them one step at a time towards the learning objectives, and also language awareness, okay? They're not just learning concepts. These 2 teachers, Silvana and Graziella, they're paying attention to CALP language in English. And this transfers to L1, okay? And look at what they write. They write in final test in L1. They use the right terminology, they mention the concepts in L1, and the number of words they wrote in L1. Okay, so that is it. Today I tried to finish on time so you can have time to ask me questions. And so thank you very much for your attention. I hope that was informative.
Yes, thank you, Teresa. This was very, very informative and a lot to think about. So lots of food for thought. Yeah, let me give the floor to others. So any questions, any comments, anything that, I don't know, made you think of, any relations to your own lessons? Anybody would like to comment on this? Yeah, welcome. Please do. Okay, then let me start. You know, when you mentioned solvable problems, do you think that, I don't know, in your case, so you showed that a content teacher was working with together with the language teacher. So do you think that that's the best combination, or I mean, can language teachers do this on their own, and can content teachers do this on their own, or you know,
well, that's a good
what's your experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends on, of course, the complexity of the concepts. You know, for for medical school immunology, we probably need to work together. We have both the content teacher and the language teacher working together. For example, remember remember the second task of the students' notes?
Yes, yes.
And the L1 textbook? Okay. So actually the L1 textbook was very easy because we just you just insert the Italian text into Google Translate, and it gives you the perfect translation of an L1. Okay, so because it's technical language, so it's pretty good. And so the content teacher would be able to check that because their English is good enough.
Yes, yes.
They can check that to see if it's okay. And then you would need to, then the English teacher, the language teacher, would be able to deconstruct that into something much more fluid and easy and more in line with what we teach them in general English. Okay, so that would require, but of course, if you're dealing with 10-year-old children and you're dealing with, I don't know, world population or things like that, then you probably can do it on your own, both the content teacher whose language is good enough or the English teacher who, of course, is familiar with the content. So it depends on the level of content.
The level of content, yeah. Okay, thank you. Yes, anybody would like to say something?
Alma, you got everything right, huh?
Yeah, I'm sure you have a question or a comment.
I apologize. I thought that we were supposed to do that in the chat box.
It's okay.
Great. No, that's
Great. We could all check.
And then I went, oh no.
And you did them all
fine,
right.
fine.
There's a problem with those. The trick there is often people think I want all the quadrants, but you were absolutely right. Just there and there, and you got them all right. Bravo.
Well, thank you very much for this really such an interesting talk and such an important topic as well. This is exactly what I'm doing with my students too. I teach at the University of Sarajevo, and I work with all years, but with my first year students, I work on contemporary English language. And in contemporary English language classes, I work with them on communication skills and oral communication skills and presentation skills as well. And we discuss contemporary topics. So it's very much content related, but it's also very much language based, of course. And I definitely focus a lot on BICS and then on CULP. And I do BICS first with them. So I focus more on this aspect I always give them 2 to 3 months to focus a little bit more on this general aspect of their social skills as well and their interpersonal skills. I think all of that is quite an important part to take into consideration. And then I focus on CULP, and depending on what concepts we're covering and what content we're covering. And this really helps so much because we didn't have this during our studies, to be honest, right? And it's quite new, I would say, in these terms being discussed in seminars and professional development. And I'm so happy and always thankful to my mentor, Professor Pijorn, who kindly invites me to join. And thank you really so much. Just put things into perspective, to be honest. I've never thought about it in these terms, believe it or not, because I'm focusing on other things as well, on the methodology of teaching and other aspects completely. But then this really put things into perspective. And one thing that I have written down during the talk is related to, at one point you said, when it comes to these two, to the student writing, and then you said at one point that the only code that we don't use is L1 BICS, I think, at one point. We use all the other three. My question is, don't we use L1 BICS as well? In terms, I always think about positive transfer, you know what I mean, in terms of, I always somehow believe that yes, L1 BICS is somewhere present because of this positive transfer that, we're using our schemata, we're using everything that we've learned so far. So couldn't there be some L1 BICS there as well that helps them with foreign language BICS to master foreign language CULP? So that was the only question that I maybe had in mind, because I used to think in those terms when working with my students. Yeah.
Well, that's a very good point, Alma.
Thank you.
What I meant there was we're not explicitly using any of those in the task. The task explicitly presents. Okay, but of course, when students are talking to each other, they'll be using L1 BICS if they share the same L1, of course.
Got it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So of course they're going to be using it, but in the task, We're just explicitly using these three, okay?
True.
And yeah, and then talking about L1 Bigs, another task which is very nice is always once they have understood a concept, once students have understood a concept, a nice task is to say, now explain it to your 12-year-old cousin. Okay? Write an SMS, write a WhatsApp, you know, that strategy. So now re-explain to your cousin, because that is when we can understand that they are not just parroting the textbook, because that's another worry.
That's an issue. Yes, it is an issue, especially with first-year students. They always come up to I do all the oral exams at our department, and then they always come to the exam fully prepared, but literally just they learn by heart some of these. And then when I interrupt them and I stop them right there and I go, yes, exactly, so how does that relate to everyday life? Then that's when I know where they stand with Bigs and Culp. Exactly. Yes, fully agree on that. Thank you so much. I do not want to take up too much time, but this is really interesting. Thank you so much.
That's a very important point. What Alma has just told us is, I'm sure we're all aware of that. We don't want them to come parroting the textbooks, L1 or foreign language textbook, because we want to make sure that they do understand. So one of the important steps in this teaching, in any content education, is to make sure that they can paraphrase it for their younger cousin. Okay, and this younger cousin, everybody has a younger cousin. So the younger cousin is always the go-to person to paraphrase to, and this is vital. Okay, to make sure, to double check that they have understood the concept. So we want them to understand, and also it teaches them to be more aware of who they are speaking to. Yeah, good. So that's good.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also happy that you mentioned translanguaging, you know, the concept of translanguaging, which is still quite new, I would say, in our educational context. And I would like you to, I don't know, how you, so to tell us how you understand it and how much of this concept has been implemented in Italian educational system.
Well, how I understand it in one phrase is it's the systematic use of two languages, systematic, and not just a teacher who's the walking dictionary of the lesson, right? Okay? The teacher who just answers a question, ¿qué significa quello? And the teacher translates everything. That is not translanguaging, okay? Nor is it explaining everything in Italian and then waiting for the teacher to then re-explain it in English. That is not translanguaging. That is why I showed you these tasks, because these are pre-designed. So the teacher is teaching, but through the tasks, okay? And these are translanguaging tasks which explicitly, the orange part explicitly does something. The green part explicitly does something, okay? And of course, when one designs these tasks, it takes a lot of time. But if you're designing things which are not going to change, immunology at this level is not going to change for the next, I don't know how long. I have colleagues at the university who teach fossil anatomy. Can you imagine how boring that is, to teach fossil anatomy? So, and they have tasks that we designed together, and they're still using it after 6 years. Exactly the same tasks, okay? To teach the students the language of describing fossils in discipline-accepted ways, okay? And so going back then to your question, Carmen, is then that's where we need at university level collaboration between the content and the language teacher. And in addition, language teachers are very good pedagogically. Now we're full of pedagogical strategies. Okay? While unfortunately, I don't know about in Slovenia, but in Italy, a chemistry teacher is just a graduate of chemistry.
Yeah.
Only recently have they started thinking maybe they should also learn how to teach. Yeah. So now, what was the other part of your question? Oh, how is it happening in
Yeah.
Italy?
Yeah.
Well, in Italy, as you say, it's a new thing, and people are beginning to get their minds around it
Mm-hmm.
and understanding what does it mean. Is it code switching? Is it explained first in English and then in Italian, or
Yeah.
first in Italian and then in English?
Mm-hmm.
And they're beginning to get their minds around it. And I think that considering L1 Calp, L1 Calp as a language, a foreign language, it puts another perspective on translanguaging.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you realize, the content teachers realize that for students, for students coming to school and learning through the school language is difficult because it's a foreign language. So when students enter, when students are 12 years old, they start going into academic language in the textbooks. Textbooks change from before 12 to 12. The textbooks start becoming academic, and that's where students, I don't know in Slovenia, but that's where students in Italy and many other countries start having problems.
Oh yeah, it's the same. It's the same. Slovenia, yeah, they do start having problems. Yes, yes.
Because suddenly we're changing the register. Okay? And so the first thing that's important in recognizing that L1 Calp is a language, and therefore L1 Calp to L1 Bix is already translanguaging.
Yeah, that's true.
But you have to do it systematically, because otherwise the students will not learn L1 Calp. The research that I didn't have time to talk about today is called Semantic Waves. Semantic Waves by Matten. And basically what that says is what we already said, the language dilemma. They complex concepts in complex language. So what do? We deconstruct it. We unpack it. And in unpacking, we write down the semantic wave. We make things easier, okay? By giving analogies and metaphors and
paraphrasing,
all these kind of things. But then we stay down. We forget to write up the wave.
Yeah, that's
to
right.
take the students back up to the help they need. And then what Alma said, to then make sure they're not just parroting. So we need to write down in a different way this time. Yeah. So we need to go up and then down again by making sure they're not parroting. Okay.
It just, crossed my mind that actually what you did with the design of this very well, in my view, you said stupid task. I would say very intelligent tasks. Is also that you use this what we call in EFL, we call task-based learning, right? Task-based teaching. So you use that approach as well, or in a way, didn't you?
Right. And actually, the reason I started thinking about this is I went to a task-based learning conference in Louvain in 2015, and the gurus of task are Ellis and those people there. And they were talking about task-based learning for languages, and their task was they were talking about in Dutch context, learning Dutch, and they were suggesting that they take their immigrant Dutch learners and they put them in a pharmacy, and they want the Dutch learners to ask the pharmacist for a painkiller. A painkiller that is not too expensive, okay? An inexpensive painkiller. And that's the task, to ask for an inexpensive painkiller. And I was thinking, what is interesting is this. Traditionally, EFL looks for complicated tasks. Because if we give our learners, if we give our learners complicated tasks, they'll produce complicated language. But that's not true. What they do is they have complicated ideas, but they don't have the language, the discourse to produce it. Because just because you have a complex idea doesn't mean you can produce the complex communication, right?
Yes.
Unless somebody has guided you through some examples, but systematic examples.
And input, right? Have given you input, yeah.
Yeah. So,
I was also, thinking of Ofelia Garcia and, what she did in this area. So in translanguaging. And then I watched a video when there was a teacher, in America, and there were a few students who were immigrants, so who have just, moved across to the United States. And so it was shown how their own languages, can help them to understand, some of the concepts. They were still small children, but still, I don't know what is numbers or it was, I think, mathematics. So that even, using your own, so it's just vice versa. So, the language that you move to, so becomes your second language, but your own language, your L1, can help in understanding the content. So translanguaging can also work in, what we would say, language learners, like English language learners but I mean, as a second language, or they can be, I don't know, Slovene language learners, so those who come to Slovenia, or Italian language learners, those who move there. And this is still kind of, I think, so new and so, I don't know, difficult to even imagine or to understand and to implement that, and that it can be useful. To see this translanguaging as a useful tool, that I think we would need more, what you have shown examples. So really, how this can work, so that people do understand it. Because I had a conversation with a linguist who told me, but be careful, because translanguaging, that can mean that they will just mix up languages, and then they won't learn any language at all. So
yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, in this ELTJ article that I mentioned, the point I made there was translanguaging was originally applied by Garcia and cohorts and it's fantastic because it's democratizing instruction, education. Because just because you don't speak the foreign language doesn't mean you don't have thinking.
Yeah, and you don't have any language, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I, who have lived in a country which doesn't speak the language I speak for many years, you feel like you're not a person because you cannot express yourself.
Yes.
And that is what the translanguaging started as a way to democratize instruction for immigrant children, right? Let's use their L1 to help them express themselves. And that's definitely true. And there was a lot of literature on creative use of L1. Now, when you apply translanguaging to teaching immunology in medical school, there is no creativity involved. That is a big difference in how this interpretation of translanguaging works. This interpretation of translanguaging means we're not into creativity, because we're dealing with STEM instruction: science, technology, and maths, engineering and maths. So in STEM instruction, we're not worried about creativity, because first the engineer, before they make a creative bridge, they have to first understand the basics of engineering. And the bridge has to have the basics of engineering. And then later on, they can be creative. But we need the basic concepts of the STEM disciplines. And so in this interpretation of translanguaging, we are dealing with language, and we're not into creative use of language because we don't have time for creative use of language. So this is kind of a tricky interpretation, kind of a niche interpretation of translanguaging. But I think if it's easier to actually deal with because you don't worry about the creativity part. Now, at the end, there was another task, etc. And then imagine then at the end of helping students learn immunology concepts, that then after they've understood the concepts, they've learned the L1 CALP from their Italian textbooks. They've seen how, of course, a foreign language BICS is useful. Of course, they've been using L1 BICS in their discussions, as Alma pointed out. And then they have the examples of the foreign language CALP textbook text. Imagine then that the concluding task, one of the concluding activities for the foreign language classroom would be now make a video to explain immunology, these immunology concepts, to the patients in the waiting room. Okay? And you can make a video which is in L1, so they practice their Slovenian about immunology. And there could be some immigrant people, so also make it in whatever foreign language about the concepts. So that would be applying their knowledge in communicating as professionals. So as medical doctors, they would need to communicate about these things to patients. So that could be a final concluding activity, after they've learned it. So it's a controlled translanguaging, very controlled.
And you make it meaningful, right? So, I mean, the tasks and problems should be meaningful for them, the specific age group, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Is it medical school students?
Yeah, exactly. And for primary school, you make it, meaningful in a different way, right?
Yeah, those were, for example, when I showed you Silvana and Graziela's work, that was for technical high school.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And there, I believe what they did, they had the students simulate a radio talk show with a famous cheese producer. And they did it in Italian and also in English. So, yeah. So after they've learned the concepts are light, then you can do all sorts of things you want with the language. Academic language, which is heavy, or little light language, which is BICS. So, yeah.
And also, I think you make them see that both languages, so also foreign language, can help you learn the content, because at the end of the day, you want to learn something new, okay? Or children, but also, older children, they're interested in the content, okay? They're not interested in the language as a system and as linguists most probably. Yeah, and this is, it's much more authentic.
Yeah, that's a very good point. They see that they can actually learn new content through English.
Yeah, exactly.
On the foreign language, whatever that is.
Yeah. And I think we all remember that, for years, teaching of languages was not primarily about content, or was not about content at all, right?
Grammar.
Yeah. And that was a problem. Yeah, a big problem.
Yeah.
Okay, any more comments, questions?
Talking about grammar, let me just insert one thing since we have a few minutes. So one task could be related to language, okay? We want to shift the focus to language grammar, because they do need some grammar, is to maybe have them choose between 3 texts, okay? Which one is well written, okay? Or which one will deserve a 10 out of 10, okay, from the teacher. And so you have three texts, 3 short texts. One of them, of course, deserves 10 out of 10. Okay, so it's well written in content and well written in language. Another one could be well written in content, but the language contains grammar mistakes if it's a foreign language text. And another one could be grammatically perfect, but content is wrong. Now, the task is decide together which one deserves a 10 out of 10. Okay, so we're having the students work together, blah, blah, blah. But the next task is not which one is correct, because that's easy. The next task is put into words what is wrong with the other two. Okay? Now, to put into words, sometimes they may not have, they may know that's wrong, but they may not know what is wrong. So depending on your learner.
Or why is wrong.
Yeah.
Why
So
it is wrong.
Yeah, so you might then give them 5 explanations. One is, there's grammar mistakes, blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And that draws their attention to the grammar mistakes. Okay? The content is wrong, or basically you shape the tasks such that you're drawing their attention to exactly what you want them to pay attention to. So instead of teachers standing up in front and saying, well, look, this is a passive and it's used incorrectly because you're not using to be in the passive past participle. Instead of doing that, you have it in the task. So the task has the verb, the to be as the auxiliary, and instead of the past participle, you have, I don't know, simple past, for example. Okay?
Yeah.
And then you say, this one is wrong because in this text, the passive, the writer intends to have a passive, but the passive is not using the past participle.
Yes.
So that gives even a label to exactly what is wrong with the text. And so you're explicitly teaching the grammar without teaching it, okay? Without standing.
And you make them pay attention, right? You get them in the what you call it a flow, right? Yeah. Very good. Yeah. So I think we have all learned quite a lot today, especially that we can learn content through foreign language, right? Or that foreign language can help us to reach L1 CALP level. And yeah, so thank you so much, Teresa. We wish you all the best, and we hope to see you again. It would be really nice to welcome you here in person. So in Ljubljana.
One day.
Yeah. I mean, you are really welcome at any time. And well, hope that when this COVID is away, when we finally reach a kind of a normal state again, so please do, get in touch, and thank you so much.
Very well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for everything, and it's been a real pleasure. I'll send you a few summaries and some references so that you can.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be very useful for our. Yeah, for the group. And we will also let you know how many people have actually watched the video, because that this is also, it's then available, and we need to check how many people can get back to the videos and watch them. But it will be also useful, very, very, very useful for our students, here at the faculty. Yeah, I know they will enjoy it. So, so now I'm just going to say something in our language. Uživajte, imejte lep večer, pazite na se in vabljeni pa dajte to nekako, torej to povabilo še razširiti, da se še drugi pridružijo. Lep večer vsem.